Okay, so some of you may have noticed this is a student's project. This is Cassie's project. I'm going to use this as an example for how to add shadows into the scene. A lot of students typically are adding figures like this into their Photoshop loading screen scene, and not everybody gets the shadows right. So I wanted to do a tutorial on how to approach that and what the best way of adding shadows in. Now I've already made a feedback video for Cassie, and I told her that I think that this would work better with the scissors not having this kind of sketchy feel to them. So she's going to work on that. So that's a separate thing though. I want to show you how to add shadows in. So she had these other ballerina figures here too. I'm going to just remove those because I just want to focus on this one, and it will be sufficient for how to add shadows. So for this image, there are two things making up the figure here. We've got the bottom half, which are the legs, and the top half, which is the scissors. So the first thing I want to do is take those two items and make a duplicate of them. So I'm going to do that, and when I duplicate them, I'll take the two duplicate copies and merge them together. Okay, so I'm going to merge the two selected layers together, and then what we'll see is we have those two in one image. Okay, um, so when we turn all the other layers back on, um, what I have then is this separate duplicated image. Next, what I want to do is take all the pixels in this layer and fill them. So what I'll do is you can control click on a Mac or right click if you have it set up in the thumbnail and go to select pixels. What I'm going to do is fill those pixels with black. So I'll just go to edit, fill. I can just take this drop down and choose black. Mode is normal, 100% opacity. Okay, so now I have this layer filled with black. Okay, and notice now we have what is basically a shadow. Whoops, what is basically a shadow that matches the shape of the item which I duplicated. So the next step is I'll want to move the shadow underneath this item, okay? Because obviously shadows appear underneath things. So I will do that. And then what I want to do is probably change my blending mode. Usually multiply works well for shadows. And then drop the opacity down a little bit, okay? And then we get kind of more of a shadow effect. Okay, and the next thing I want to do is I want to transform this, and there's a few different ways to transform it. I think that the first thing I'm going to try is the perspective transform. Okay, that may or may not work, but we'll find one that does work, and this all depends on the perspective of your image. And then the other thing to look at is how the light is already working in the image. Okay, so if I kind of zoom in here and take a look at the background, I can see, well, the first thing I see is Cassie, I think, did possibly some other edits to the background. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe the original was like this, but I'm thinking not. But if I look at the shadows in the scene, I can see that it looks like the shadows are possibly like very close to being underneath the cows and also like falling this way a little bit. So the light seems to be coming down from the top left, falling to the right, kind of in this direction. Okay, so I want to remember that. I want to remember which direction the light is falling. Um, so what I'll do is I'm going to select my shadows, and I'm going to squish them by quite a bit, because if we think about how shadows fall, if the light is coming from the top and shining down, then we're going to see the shadow like underneath this object a little bit, okay? So just by doing that, we kind of get this effect of a shadow underneath and on the ground. Now, The next thing I want to think about is, are both of these toes touching the ground? I think from the image it looks like it. So what I kind of want to do is try to position the shadow as if it is touching. And I think instead of turning it like that, what I'm going to do is go to Edit, Transform, and then I'm going to skew this a little bit to try to get these shadows to stretch up to where their base is, okay? And that's how shadows work. Of course, the shadow is going to touch the base of the image. Okay, so it's kind of almost there. Maybe if I rotate it slightly, we'll kind of get a little bit closer. Okay. And then the next thing I'm going to want to do is, I know I mentioned using the perspective tool and I haven't gotten to that, but here we'll do it now. So I went to Edit, Transform, Perspective, and we can try to like stretch this a little bit and see if we can get it falling towards, remember I said the light was coming from the left and going down this way, and so the shadow is going to kind of fall that way. So I'm going to try to move it over a little bit. Okay? So if, you know, looking at the image, the shadow seemed to be coming this way, this would actually work pretty good where it's at if it were a nice crisp shadow. But I noticed we don't have nice crisp shadows. On an overcast day, you never have crisp shadows. They're soft. And then also the shadow does seem to still be further underneath the object. So I'm going to further manipulate the shadow copy, which I should have named. I'll name it now, shadow. Okay, and I'm going to squish it even further up this way, because that's closer to how the shadows are working in the scene. Okay, so now we have this kind of very squished shadow. The next thing I'm going to do is it's kind of a softened shadow since we have this overlap here. So I'm going to blur the shadow, go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and I'm just going to start kind of spreading this shadow out a little bit until it seems a little bit more realistic. Now, with a very soft shadow like this, you'll notice when I added the blur, it almost disappeared here. The other thing we can do is we can actually manually paint in a shadow. And again, not all of these steps are something that you'll necessarily use. It depends on your image. For this image, I probably need this just because of the way, how small it is and how squished it gets to be. But you may or may not need to actually do the step that I'm going to do here, which is kind of painting in the shadow. So again, if I go back to blurring this, and starting to place the blur in, where the thinner parts of the scissors were, the shadow is starting to disappear with too high of a blur. So what I probably want to do is go back in here with a brush, just a black brush, right on my shadow layer. I am going to use, since this is a soft shadow, I'm going to use a very low hardness brush. And I will choose black, okay, at 100% opacity, because remember, I've dropped the opacity on my shadow layer. So this has a low opacity. So even though I paint with 100% opacity here, it's not all going to show through. But, oh, how come this is hard? I thought I chose a soft brush. I did choose a soft brush, but, am I on a pencil? Oh, it's on pencil and not brush. So when I actually choose a brush that's soft, it will show up as soft. And what I can do is kind of go back in and paint over the areas where I think it needs to be filled in a little bit more. And what I can do is kind of follow along the original contours that are left from the actually manipulated image. And this gets to be very like kind of fuzzy for this one since it's such a squat, short shadow. However, we've all seen shadows where it's a really crisp shadow that matches kind of the outline of the figure. And so keep that in mind too. This is all going to depend on what the shadow needs to look like for the lighting. Okay, so now we have kind of the shape that more closely matches and yet is filled in those areas. I can do a little bit more blurring here. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and just bump this up a little bit to make it feel a little bit more kind of to match the scene. Okay. And then the last thing I want to do is, in most cases, the shadow is very, very dark, like right underneath objects. And then it kind of, as it fades away a little bit, it's a little bit softer. So what I'm seeing here is this whoops. There's like some white parts that are kind of a little bit distracting for the shadow, so I'm just going to clear these out with the eraser tool. Those are a little bit distracting when we're trying to see a shadow, but what we see is white. Clear that out so we have a nice dark edge. Okay, and then the same thing over here. Okay, so the other thing I want to do, I'm going to call the shadow base. The other thing I want to do is kind of darken up the spots right underneath where the feet are falling. So I'll do another layer here. I create another layer. I'll call it shadow dark. I'll also change it to multiply. I'm going to leave the opacity at 100% for the moment. And what I want to do is right underneath the objects with my black soft brush, I'm going to kind of paint a little bit darker shadow right underneath those, right? And possibly spread it out a little bit more. Same thing over here. I can see a little bit more white here in doing that, so I will, oops, on my legs layer, clear out that white even more. It might be hard to see in the video, but I can see it on my screen here. Okay, and then I have some darker spots there underneath the feet, and of course this one we'll drop the opacity here a little bit for this one. We kind of want this to start to blend in with the base shadow so that it feels a little bit realistic, right? So it does start to do that. I might want to use the blur filter on this just slightly. Just so, definitely not at 47%, but just so that it starts to blend a little bit better with the shadow underneath it. Okay, then it feels a little bit more realistic because, again, very often the shadow is much darker right underneath the object where there's no chance for the light fall off to be happening. So with that there, I think we're pretty close to having our shadows looking pretty good. So I'll put those two in a group together, and even from there I could manipulate it a little bit further, like with the overall opacity or what have you. Okay, and so I think what that does, now looking at this image, is it really makes it feel like these feet are standing on this grass now, right? Before it didn't, they're just floating here. Now with some shadows added, it feels like they're placed on the grass and kind of firm there, and it feels much more like a realistic kind of something happening here. Okay, so again, depending on the light, your shadows may be a lot more crisp and have a much more defined outline. If the light source is lower to the ground, then it may be a much longer shadow, or it may go in a different direction entirely just based on the scene. So you really have to use the scene as a guide for how that's going to work, but I think that this is the basics of it. So let me know if you have any questions.